Welcome to Audible Insights, brought to you by the Insights Association and hosted by David Paul, founder of Dialsmith and Lillian Labs.
We're coming to you from the floor of the Insights Association's Corporate Researchers Conference in Orlando. And I have the pleasure of being joined for this conversation by Steve August. Steve was the founder of Revelation and later served as Chief Innovation Officer and Chief Marketing Officer for Focus Vision. Steve, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, David. It's great to be here.
It's great to chat with you. So for those who don't know your story, take us through your journey through the market research industry.
Sure. I like to say I blame my wife for the whole adventure. Because I came into market research, as a lot of people do, almost by accident. And my wife was actually the real researcher in the family. She was the one with the master's degree in consumer behavior. And she had her own consulting business. And in 2002, when our daughter was born, we had a choice. I was working at a job, museum exhibit design of all things, that was wonderfully satisfying, but didn't pay very well. And so we decided to make my wife's business the family business. And so I started supporting her in the business. And Kimberly's specialty was ethnography and in-homes and in-depth qual. And so I'd see her going to people's houses, and in advance she would create these paper diaries, like to see what was going on while she wasn't there, so that she could be better informed about what was going on when she was there. Right. And I was looking at this, and it was around 2003, 2004, and I said, well, we have these things called blogs. They're kind of like web diaries, web diary, paper diary. Maybe we could make this easier, because you see all the effort. She's going to Kinko's at the time and creating the booklets, then sending them out FedEx, and then had all this information at the end that had to be integrated into her reporting and her analysis. And it just seemed like a lot of work that could be made easier. So we started playing with blogging systems, off-the-shelf blogging systems, and we started doing some projects with it and testing it out, and we were like, oh my gosh, this seems to be working really well.
Pretty well.
Yeah, like people are sharing a lot more than we thought they were. And so we started speaking about it at industry events. I think actually the first one we spoke at was the MRA event in Las Vegas that happens every year.
Yeah.
The 3-chapter event.
Right.
And people came up to us afterwards and said, wow, that's really cool. Can we use your platform? And I said, well, you could, but you wouldn't want to.
Yeah.
Because you had to be pretty technical. You had to know HTML. You had to. It was, and the thing that it output was, I mean, I had to print out web pages, then strip the HTML, and it was really rudimentary.
It was the early days.
It was the early days.
Yeah.
And I said, but I bet you we could build something that people would want to use and would make our job a lot easier. And that's how the idea of Revelation came to be.
That's a very cool story.
And so we hired, we took in some friends and family money, and we hired a web developer or a web app developer. And we were living at San Francisco in the time, and we built the first version, released it in 2006. It was sitting on one Rackspace server in Austin, and it didn't know time zones. It didn't. It could barely put out a transcript. But it did things at the time that the other bulletin board offerings couldn't do. And it was one of those epiphanies is like, I looked at it and I said, all the tools at the time are replicating a methodology. We have focus groups offline, let's just put focus groups online. But what I saw as the opportunity was, if the mission is to understand people, to understand business questions, what does the technology give us the ability to do? And so to think through, wow, if we can get into their experiences and get closer to their experiences, then we'll have a better understanding, and therefore we can answer the questions better. And that's why we developed it the way we did. It's almost an ethnography platform more than a bulletin board.
Right.
Yeah. And so we raised some money after that. We got some initial clients as I started speaking about it, and we actually split Revelation out from my wife's consulting company because they were two different companies.
Sure.
And we started to grow as my first business.
Yeah. Wow.
And I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I knew more than I did.
Yeah.
And that's the thing with business, is that it what you're really good at is different than running a business and growing a business.
Always,
There's two different skill sets.
Right.
And that was one of the things that I needed to learn. and did through this learning curve of growing a business and growing it up to, millions in revenue and 20 plus people.
Yeah.
And it was a journey. It was challenging in so many different ways.
Right. Ups and downs.
A lot of ups and downs. I threw it into the ditch a few times, had to pull it out of the ditch a few times. And it took its toll too along the way. As anybody who's run a business knows that, there's a lot of mental energy that gets expended on the journey.
Yeah.
But we kept growing, and in 2014 we had the opportunity to get acquired by Focus Vision, and it was a great match actually.
Yeah.
Because what we had hit at that point is like we were supporting global research companies out of Portland, Oregon.
Right.
And it's a really tough time zone to do global support out of.
Yeah, West Coast is.
Yeah, so what we needed was more salespeople and more service people and a bigger footprint. And it turned out Focus Vision needed a platform like Revelation, and they had a ton of salespeople and a big global footprint.
Yeah.
And it was like one of those things that just made a lot of sense.
Yeah, it seems like a natural fit.
Yeah, and so it was the right time, and it worked out for everybody, and Revelation's still going on within Focus Vision to this day.
That's really great. Yeah, so then moving on from that, obviously that was a big life change for you and great success. Congratulations on that. So what did you decide to do next in your career? Either what are you doing now next, or what's next for you? How does Steve August's story continue to unfold?
Right. So I continued to work for Focus Vision. I had an earn-out year, so I did that, and then right as that happened, was coming to a close, Focus Vision had bought Decipher and a number of other companies and had packaged it all together and sold it to another private equity company. And I was in a position that I had options, and I was like, well, I should probably stick around and see if these options, cash in. And, I was blessed that they did. And then I stayed for another year. I was became the chief marketing officer. So I had this amazing experience of answering to a private equity board, and all the glamour of it, of traveling to New York and London, and then also the challenge of it. It's a very demanding way of looking at the world and how they want a company to grow. So I did that up until 2017, and then I realized I was ready for new things. It had been the whole journey from idea to exit to your earn out and beyond. It was, I'd done what I needed to do.
Yeah, a big chunk of your life.
Yeah. So I stepped out in the beginning of 2017, February 2017, and then people started coming to me and asking, hey, I got some things going on in my business. I'd love to get your perspective. You seem to have been through it, a lot of different things. And I said, sure, happy to help. And I found that I really enjoyed helping people think through their business issues and their biggest questions, and saw that everybody was going through that kind of journey who was running a company. There's this, and it can be a very lonely journey, especially if they're a solo founder. That there's only there's not very many spaces where they can actually talk about what's really going on, and then have somebody who's been there reflect back and help them work through those issues. And it felt really gratifying to me. It felt really satisfying, and I really loved it. And so I started to continue to get deeper into how do you be a coach, how do you learn how to go deeper, and started to see that it wasn't just the business level, it was the transformations in the people as well that was happening with my clients.
Well, that sounds very gratifying and rewarding. It's kind of the culmination of everything that you've learned and been through, and now to help people get through that maybe a little bit easier than you were able to at times, or help them foresee things that they don't realize are coming down the pike, but you are absolutely certain they will be.
Yeah. I think a big part of the challenge in being, especially the first-time founder, is you don't know what's sort of normal. Like you don't know what your baselines are. Everything's happening, and and good things happen, and it's like, that's great. Then challenges happen, and how do you contextualize that? How do you put that in where it's supposed to be, in the context that it's supposed to be? Because sometimes it's very natural to have a challenge. Like if you grow and grow and grow, at some point you're going to hit a plateau, and you're going to have to rearrange your company a little bit, right? Especially that early first phase for founders, where it's very founder driven, or in terms of the selling and the doing, and you get to, and there's plenty of, at the beginning, because you're just building the business, there's plenty of time and bandwidth to take on both those activities. But as the success starts to happen, you're not able to sell and do. And that kind of pattern is very normal.
Yeah.
And to know that it's normal and to say, oh, this is just where you are, here's what you might want to think about, and how do you want to do it?
Yeah. So what are you up to today then? How are you kind of formalizing this for yourself, and what kinds of services are you offering now?
Yeah, so I have two main services that I do, and they work together. The first is my one-to-one private coaching. So I sit down and I create that space and be that resource for founders, and especially visionary founders who are, a lot of times people will start a company not because they're like, I got to start a company. It's because they want to put something across to the world. They've come up with some new way of looking at some methodology, some way of helping other companies, other people do better at what they're doing.
So it's an accidental founder. They've got something they want to put out in the world, and that's the only way to do it.
Right, yeah. And so they become a business person.
Yeah.
And so I help them with that, understanding what that entails. And that's really gratifying in that we have a lot of time, we have a space. It's in person or it's over Zoom, and we meet once or twice a month, and we keep them moving forward. Yeah. And it's amazing to see the transformations that have happened.
Yeah.
And then this year I've introduced retreats as well into my business, because one of the things that I found in Revelation when I was running that and growing that was it's really hard to be able to step back and get some quiet and get some space. There's always incoming. There's always a million emails, whether it's from customers, your team, advisors, board, investors. And sometimes you just need to separate and remind yourself what it is to be just you for a little bit.
Yeah.
And so what we do with these retreats, they're digital detox retreats. So people give up their phones when they arrive, and it's a very, very specific, very deliberate sequence of events. And we go out into nature. We go and we do some very presencing activities. So the last one we did whitewater rafting, and it's really hard to worry about your marketing problem when you're on a Class 4 rapid.
Yeah.
Right? It's just you're fully present in that moment, and so often we're not in that moment.
Yeah.
Like we're here, but we're thinking about something else, right? And most of the time we're ruminating on something that happened in the past and figuring out what we should have done, or we're worried about what's going to happen in the future and how we're going to, succeed or avoid, catastrophe.
Yeah.
And so having 3 or 4 days where you're actually just thinking about what's going on right now, and then taking that quiet and that perspective and that shift, and then applying it to a problem or a challenge. And so everybody who comes to the retreat with a challenge, and on the last day, we all help each other process their challenges.
That's when you circle back to address it. But by then, heads have been cleared out, and everybody has space to think.
Absolutely.
So what's that last day like, especially as you were doing, let's say, your first one where you didn't know exactly what to expect? What were people like on that last day when they've gone through the detox and now they're actually coming back to do the hard work again, but in a different mindset?
They is amazing. It's transformative. They come into it and they see things differently. They see a little bit of a shift because they're not in that mode of reacting. They're able to get space and then look at the problem, and it's sort of like shifting the problem, the angle on it, and I facilitate them through and along with the help, and we start to see what's the real problem. Because often the surface problem is just a manifestation of what's going on in their own heads, their own stories. So my firm belief and experience with entrepreneurship is one of the most amazing personal growth platforms ever devised. Because if there is a trigger or a button for that to be pushed for you as a person, running a business will push them, will trigger them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's a tremendous service, because once they're surfaced, then we know what we're dealing with. Once you become aware of it, then you can say, okay, this is how I'm shaping my world. And, I had one person who, they were pushing really hard, and, partly it was a cash flow issue, but the story driving that was they were never going to be good enough. right? And so we had to kind of look at both those stories. It's like, where is this coming from? Because those stories, as the founder and the CEO, actually drive the business.
Yeah.
Like they have a funny way of working their way into the business, and that was totally true when I was working Revelation.
Yeah.
All my stories, and I had big things around scarcity and worthiness and things like that.
Yeah.
Was all part of what made Revelation challenging.
Yeah.
Right. It was like having your foot on the gas and the brake at the same time.
Well, and what you find as a founder, speaking from experience myself, is that it also never lets up. The notion of work-life balance, or I go to work during the day, I go home in the evening. When you're a founder, CEO, that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's everything all the time.
Yeah.
You're always a family person. You're always running your company. And I guess I will say that over time, you get better at it. You learn how to deal with it. But when things get tough on any one major side of your life, it seeps into all of that.
Yes.
And that's when things start to just become really heavy.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely. And that's a lot of what we practice, in my coaching is how do you be resilient and how do you stay level in that when things are crashing around you? And from personal experience, my family's had a really tough challenge with health this year. 2 out of 3 people in my family have had really major issues.
Yeah.
And so I had to stay level and, be the pillar in the midst of all this, and yet not get caught up in, all the emotion of it.
Right.
You can't be a robot, but on the other hand, a lot of this stuff, and this is the work I do for myself, and I bring it to my clients, is like, well, how do you process this stuff? How do you stay that? Because a lot of it does come down to, it's not just the event, it's how we interpret the event. Right. It's the judgment we place on ourselves when something goes wrong.
Yeah.
What we perceive to be wrong. And
well, before we started recording, you said something. You said events are neutral, right? Finish that.
Yeah. So I think it was Eckhart Tolle who said events are neutral. Our perceptions of them are what determine whether they're negative or positive.
Right.
So that I'm coming to believe more and more.
Yeah.
Like the event happens, and I've seen this. Like what is initially feels like a very negative setback, actually tends to be a message that you need to change something, right? And it means it's time to evolve. And change is hard, especially when things are good and all of a sudden they're not.
Right.
Like making that shift, it's like you want to maintain that previous state. That previous state might not be available anymore. And this is just showing you the way. But it's all in how you interpret it. And that was one of the hardest things about when I was doing Revelation and being in that seat is I would always pass judgment on it, and generally judgment on myself when something went wrong. I would say, oh, it's because something I did or something I am.
Well, and at the end of the day, it's your responsibility anyway, right?
Yeah.
The buck always stops with you.
Right. But that doesn't mean it defines you.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the thing that I work a lot about is like, a company is something you have. It's not something you are. And as a founder, it's really easy to get your identity really intertwined with your company. You're out there, you're advocating for it, you're evangelizing for it. But at the end of the day, if you take that company away, you're still you, right? And no amount of success is going to necessarily validate you. And no amount of failure is going to invalidate you when it comes to that.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of listeners here are certainly not founders, they're not CEOs, but I imagine what you're talking about really applies to anyone who is working in the professional space, and even more so for those who have stressful, challenging jobs, founder or not. These are things that anyone trying to juggle work and family ends up having to deal with at some point, right? Yeah,
absolutely. Life happens, and negative events or events happen, and it's our ability to be resilient and press on and thrive in the midst of that. And it's one of those things where it takes some time to get awareness of like what's the event, or what's happening, and what is my emotion and my feeling and my judgments around what's happening. And then the more we can raise our awareness and separate those two, the more we can kind of see what's really happening.
Yeah. So what would be one good takeaway that you'd leave with anyone listening that they could apply to their lives or try for the next day or week or month, that you would just encourage everyone to just give X a try, and that you believe it will have some measure of benefit to their lives?
Yeah. So I would say whenever something happens that you perceive as negative, stop, take 3 breaths, really think about it, and try to listen in on why is it negative, right? And see if you can separate what the event is from the emotion and the judgment around it, and what story might be popping up in your head that, and if you start to see that, you'll start to see the world differently.
Yeah. And that applies to work, family, friends,
everything.
Doesn't matter, right?
Yeah. And our stories drive us. I'll give you a quick example.
Sure.
So I had set up an initial coaching call with a potential client last week, and we had set up a certain time, and it was on a Wednesday, and on Monday I realized we had a doctor's appointment that it came up, and I had to shift an hour later. So I wrote and said, hey, let's shift an hour later if that works for you. If not, let me know another good time. Yeah. And I didn't hear from the person. And I followed up a couple more times, never heard from them. And then, the time came, and I showed up on the Zoom, and they didn't, and I never heard from them. And there was a story firing up in my head. It was, oh, that person probably doesn't want to work with me now because I asked to shift this time, and they think now I'm not going to be reliable. And
that's where my head would have gone to, for sure.
Right. And then, but I caught it. Right. I said, oh, that's the story I'm telling myself. I have no idea what's going on in that person's life. Their week could be so off the rails right now that this just fell down the priority level. And that might be what happened. And so I said, okay, I'm just going to put it down. And I'm not going to believe that story. Yeah. I heard it. I don't need to listen to that one. And then they followed up, a couple days later and said, sorry for standing you up. I had a hard week, and let's see if we can reschedule. Right. I would love to talk. Yeah. So all that mental energy that I would have, even a few years ago, spent on, oh my gosh, I blew it, and
and then 2 more days of that until you heard back from them. Right. That's exhausting and often crippling.
Right. And totally wasted energy. Because it had nothing to do with what was actually going on. Right. So that's the example of separating the event from the story you spin in your mind about it.
I think that's really good advice. So for people who want to learn more about your coaching business and about your retreats, what's the best way for them to do that?
SteveAugustCoaching.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn, and I've been publishing a series of articles called Meditations for Entrepreneurs.
I've been enjoying it. Yeah.
So I take a quote from philosophy and show how it applies to entrepreneurship. Yeah. So those are the best places to find me.
And it's a really smart series, so I do recommend that if you're interested, I definitely recommend you check that out. It's well done.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, Steve, thanks so much for chatting with us. This is definitely a different conversation for a market research conference, but I think it's great. It's a breath of fresh air, and I'm sure it's something a lot of people think about and even struggle with a lot of the time. So hopefully this will be helpful.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. You can find all our episodes by searching Audible Insights on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play, and by visiting insightsassociation.org/audible. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next time.